I began this article arguing for a theory of culturally relevant pedagogy. I also suggested that the tensions that surround my position as a native in the research field force me to face the theoretical and philosophical biases I bring to my work in overt and explicit ways. Thus, I situated my work in the context of Black feminist thought. I suggested that culturally relevant teaching must meet 3 criteria: an ability to develop students academically, a willingness to nurture and support cultural competence, and the development of a socio-political or critical consciousness. End quote. What does it mean to be culturally relevant? All of our schools are obsessed with this idea that teaching must be culturally relevant. We're told that if teaching isn't culturally relevant, then students won't learn. What does that even mean? Where does that idea, that term, culturally relevant, come from? I never once heard anything about being culturally relevant and doing culturally relevant teaching or learning while I was in school. How did this idea go from non-existence to one of the most pervasive practices in education today? Does being culturally relevant mean that what students learn in the classroom must be relevant to their culture? Does it mean that students learn differently depending on how and where they are raised? Does this have anything to do with teachers saying that all students must see their culture represented in the curriculum? At some point, someone must have defined what culturally relevant meant and forwarded an argument as to why being culturally relevant is essential for student learning. Otherwise, how did it get here? How did it get everywhere we look in all of our schools? Who defined it? And what was their argument? Who have the schools been listening to? The National Education Association, the largest labor union in the United States, tells us that teaching must be culturally relevant. Likewise, all of the education schools that train our future teachers tell us that teaching must be culturally relevant. Your district administrators likely tell you that teaching must be culturally relevant, and your children are likely receiving a culturally relevant education. Writers for Education Week, America's most trusted source of education news, say that classrooms must be culturally relevant because, quote, "For decades, researchers have found that teachers in public schools have undervalued the potential for academic success among students of color, setting low expectations for them and thinking of cultural differences as barriers rather than assets to learning. In response, scholars developed teaching methods and practices, broadly known as asset-based pedagogies, that incorporate students' cultural identities and lived experiences into the classroom as tools for effective instruction. The terms of these approaches to teaching vary from culturally responsive teaching and culturally sustaining pedagogy to the more foundational, culturally relevant pedagogy. Though each term has its own components defined by different researchers over time, all these approaches to teaching center the knowledge of traditionally marginalized communities in the classroom instruction. As a result, all students, and in particular students of color, are empowered to become lifelong learners and critical thinkers." End quote. That's quite an assertion. This idea that teachers just expect less of non-white children, believing that their cultural differences hinder their ability to learn and achieve. If you didn't know, researchers do indeed observe what is called an achievement gap, which has recently been rebranded to the opportunity gap to shift framing and push the political agenda we're discussing today, between Asian students and white students, broadly speaking, between white students and Hispanic students, broadly speaking, and between all other students and black students, broadly speaking. This achievement gap has persisted for decades, and for decades conservatives, classical liberals, and leftists have argued as to what causal factors generate this observed gap in student achievement between groups of students. Conservatives and classical liberals are actually mostly aligned on this issue. They generally find cause in the breakdown of the family and parental education, arguing that students from intact families with a married mother and a father who both completed high school and work full-time generally find more academic success than those students raised by a single mother or parents who don't work or haven't completed high school. And all of the available research in this domain, I would argue, suggests they are right. I wrote about this extensively in my first book, The Woke Warpath, and what I uncovered in my research was shocking. For instance, have you ever considered that something as simple as talking to your children more when they're very young might set them up to achieve at higher levels when they enter school? Quote, "The concerted cultivation of children can have enormous payoffs. For instance, college-educated mothers read and speak more to their children. This additional stress results in a significant word gap between families along socioeconomic lines. One study, published in the American Journal of Speech-Language Pathology, found that children whose mothers graduated from college were exposed to 3,000 or so more words per day, translating into a 4 million word gap by 4 years of age between the highest and lowest socioeconomic groups. That gap jumps to nearly 30 million words when comparing only the top and bottom 2% of families." End quote. Now, there are many interesting arguments as to why the achievement gap persists, and for your average person arguing in good faith, most of them boil down to family, education, and economics. It is a complex issue because there are a million factors at play, and things as small as having an extra conversation or two a day with your 2-year-old can have a significant impact on their achievement later in life, so it seems. But for 30 years now, the schools haven't been entertaining the arguments that conservatives and classical liberals have forwarded as to the causes of the observed achievement gap between loosely defined student groups. The schools don't think the family, parental education, time spent studying, or income are the primary levers of academic success, because for 30 years, the schools have been controlled by leftists. Leftists whose Marxist educational scholar Isaac Gottesman tells us have completely taken over our educational system by 1992, had completely taken up Paulo Freire's critical theory of education and began applying it to teacher education programs. The critical turn in education radicalized the field. And this isn't even slightly controversial to say. One of these leftist radicals, who received a first-rate Marxist education during the critical turn, would go on to develop culturally relevant pedagogy, also known as culturally relevant teaching. Her name is Gloria Ladson-Billings, and she is to this day heralded as the creator of our school's most prized educational concept, the idea that schools and teaching must center the knowledge of traditionally marginalized communities in classroom instruction, as Education Week explained. In 1988, Gloria Ladson-Billings received a grant to begin conducting her research that would later lead to the publication of Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy in 1995, a paper that has been officially cited now nearly 13,000 times. When our schools talk about being culturally relevant, they are drawing on what they learned from Gloria Ladson-Billings. It is she who is mostly responsible for injecting culturally relevant teaching into the mainline artery of our educational system. It is she who defined the program and argued that it was the essential lever for overcoming the student achievement gap, along with her other most well-known work, Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education, published in the same year. If we want to answer the questions we set out to answer at the beginning of our discussion today, we must understand Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy, because it is this paper that cast a spell over our elite educational institutions and pushed them deeper down the path that has eventually led to many of the poor academic outcomes we're now dealing with. Why can't kids read, write, or do math anymore? There are a lot of reasons, many of which we'll discuss on this channel in future episodes, but one of the biggies is that grandma woke. had decided that learning to read, write, and do math, as you or I would understand it, isn't the goal of good teaching. Good teaching, as she calls it, must lead to the development of a socio-political or critical consciousness, which is to say that good teaching must radicalize children and draw them into the Marxist faith. Gloria Ladson-Billings burst onto the scene as the latest scholar to take Brazilian Marxist Paulo Freire's methods and adopt them specifically for the U.S. context. Dr. James Lindsay and I wrote about this specific point in The Queering of the American Child, and I think it might help to draw in a section of that writing to help build up some of the context surrounding the discussion we're going to have today, so we can understand the project Gloria Ladson-Billings was stepping into, to help us better understand the motivating force behind the paper we're going to read. This is a longer passage, 7 paragraphs, I think, but I'm hoping it will help us avoid some weeds when we get into the paper in a few minutes by reading this now. Quote, Paulo Freire's theory and methods were introduced to the U.S. in the late 1980s, where they spread like wildfire, thanks in large part to the tireless efforts of Henry Giroux. In The Marxification of Education, best-selling author and world-renowned anti-Marxist Dr. James Lindsay describes Giroux's evangelism and Paulo Freire's reception in North America this way. And now, this is a quote from The Marxification of Education. Thanks to the relentless efforts, the praxis, of critical Marxist educators, most of all his disciple and evangelist Henry Giroux, who was openly a communist, Freire's work was eventually welcomed into the heart of North American academic educational canon. This occurred significantly because of the tireless work of Giroux and other critical pedagogues in the 1970s and 1980s. Giroux deserves the most blame for this unlikely feat, however, since he personally worked through the first half of the 1980s to see that at least 100 critical Marxists were tenured as professors in colleges of education. Thus, by the time Paulo Freire's 1985 book, The Politics of Education, burst onto the North American scene following a favorable review in the Harvard Educational Review in that same year, the critical pedagogy runway was laid, and the plane carrying this failure of an educational model could land in the North American education scene. And now this is us coming back to the queering of the American child. Freire was wholly embraced by an academic left in education that now enjoyed status and tenure. From their ivory tower, they studied his work with what can only be described as a cult religious conviction. Books like Pedagogy of the Oppressed, The Politics of Education, and Education for Critical Consciousness convinced, conned, educators to completely abandon what U.S. education once was, already heavily influenced by the social reconstructionists, in favor of Freire's prophetic vision. Education was now more about social engineering than learning, more about addressing inequality than imparting knowledge, and more about critical social justice than reading, writing, and math. Many people picked up Freire's torch, busily trying to figure out how to adopt Freire's theory and methods first to teacher education programs and then to K-12 education. Freire situated his work in the context of poor and illiterate Brazilian farmers, so his methods required tweaking to make more sense in a country where the primary political pain points were race, sex, and sexuality rather than economic class or colonial status. Luckily for the critical educators who would contribute most to the project of situating Freire's theory into a U.S. context, Henry Giroux, Peter McLaren, Joe Kinchlow, and Gloria Ladson-Billings, the university system was already bursting at the seams with new critical theories of race, ethnicity, culture, sex, and sexuality. The pioneers of North American critical pedagogy drew from post-colonial theory, critical multiculturalism, postmodernism, critical race theory, and queer theory. They made critical pedagogy interdisciplinary to incorporate the elements needed to address specific domains of oppression. For instance, if an educator was working with Black children, they could employ a critical race pedagogy, critical race theory plus critical pedagogy, to help these children develop their critical race consciousness. Or, if an educator was addressing the topics of sex, gender, and sexuality, they could employ queer pedagogy, queer theory plus critical pedagogy, to help those children develop their queer consciousness. Although you can find numerous examples of grade school teachers deploying critical pedagogy in their classrooms as early as the 1980s, it wasn't until Gloria Ladson-Billings developed culturally relevant teaching that critical pedagogy went mainstream in children's classrooms. Ladson-Billings, the Marxist educator who popularized culturally relevant teaching, the other CRT, is one of Freire's direct theoretical descendants. Several generations removed from Freire's canonical texts, many of today's teachers and administrators have no idea that Freire's critical theory of education underpins one of their most prized educational concepts. Paulo Freire considered economic class, reinforced through colonial occupation, the primary axis of oppression, meaning he thought that the bourgeoisie used traditional education to stratify society between a ruling class and a working class or peasants. Ladson-Billings was educated during the critical turn in education when Marxists mostly abandoned the working class while busily applying critical theory to identity politics. Her education left her convinced that teachers could only be successful in liberating their students if they were equipped with unique theories and tools to address not only class, but race, ethnicity, sexuality, and culture in their classrooms. Following this conviction and drawing on the works of other Marxist education scholars like Michael Apple, Peter McLaren, Henry Giroux, and Elizabeth Ellsworth, Ladson-Billings took Freire's Maoist framework and customized it for U.S. schools. She developed her theory of culturally relevant teaching to address multiple domains of oppression, not just economic class. Culturally relevant teaching, in other words, is intersectional. It is meant to address the cumulative ways in which multiple forms of discrimination combine, overlap, and intersect in the lives and experiences of students. Like the Freirean teacher, the culturally relevant teacher's job is explicitly given as to develop a critical consciousness in students, teaching them how to use a Marxist socio-political analysis to understand how their cultural identity, their race, sex, gender, etc., and the lived experiences are excluded from classrooms and society. In practice, this means telling children that a ruling class, a dominant culture, oppresses them because they are poor, black, Hispanic, Native American, a girl, lesbian, gay, trans, or fat. After learning that they are oppressed, children are meant to begin practicing critical reflection, reflecting on their culture, identity, and experiences from a Marxist standpoint. This critical reflection is designed to motivate students to take up radical political activism, just as Freire prescribed. Gloria Ladson-Billings was explicit about her program's goal when she published Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy in 1995. Culturally relevant teaching must, she observes, lead to the development of a socio-political or critical consciousness. Furthermore, she writes, beyond individual characteristics of academic achievement and cultural competence, students must develop a broader socio-political consciousness that allows them to critique the cultural norms, values, mores, and institutions that produce and maintain social inequalities. School administrators and teachers today have been trained to believe that culturally relevant teaching is the only way to ensure that their instructional methods are diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Ladson-Billings, in fact, described her Freirean approach in 1995 with the tagline, "But that's just good teaching." Culturally relevant teaching is now considered an essential practice for eliminating achievement gaps between student groups, reducing classroom conflict, and maximizing every student's equal shot at the same outcome, as it is so often phrased. Today, teachers everywhere are trained to think they must make their materials and methods culturally relevant for children to be successful in school. Most of these teachers have been duped, but many know what they are doing. End quote. Gloria Ladson-Billings wasn't just some teacher who was wondering how she could better help Black children succeed in schools. She was, and still is, a radical, one who is attempting to fundamentally transform schools, fundamentally redefine what knowledge is, what teaching is, what it means to know and learn, fundamentally try to teach kids how to read their world so they can change it, teach kids how to ruthlessly criticize all that exists, teach kids how to be radical leftist activists. This is what culturally relevant pedagogy is designed to do. It is designed to completely rehaul and transform education to produce children who are literate in activism. And you don't have to take my word for it. We can read the paper. Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy, published in the American Educational Research Journal in 1995. Now, I'm not going to read the entire paper, but we are going to cover a lot of it. I'll cite and discuss in sequential order, so you can follow along if you'd like, by accessing the link to the paper in this video description. Okay, what does GLB, that's how I'm going to refer to her throughout, just because I'm going to end up saying her name so often and it's just a mouthful. What does GLB have to say about culturally relevant teaching? What is it? Why do we need it? What arguments does she make? And what is it designed to do? Quote, teacher education programs throughout the nation have coupled their efforts at reform with revised programs committed to social justice and equity. Thus, their focus has become the preparation of prospective teachers in ways that support equitable and just educational experiences for all students. End quote. This is a direct reference to the critical turn in education. The achievement gap issue has been an issue for a long time, but it was in the 80s and 90s that the discussion reached a fever pitch, primarily because Marxists had taken over education and were using the emotionally charged nature of the issue as cover for completely transforming U.S. education. They latched onto honest reform efforts, as they always do, to push their agenda and eventually completely take over the original issues or grievances and replace it with their radical agenda. You think you're sick of hearing about social justice and equity? Think this is all started in 2017 or even back in 2012? No. For decades, Marxists have been realigning all of education for a commitment to social justice and equity. For decades, they have been transforming teacher preparation programs, which, I don't know, might explain why so many young teachers are so woke. I don't know. Maybe. Just maybe. Quote, rather than looking at programmatic reform, this article considers educational theorizing about teaching itself and proposes a theory of culturally focused pedagogy that might be considered in the reformation of teacher education. End quote. A reformation in teacher education. Whoa. Now, she almost certainly meant reformation, but one can't help but wonder if she meant reformation as in a new religious splitting, a break from the old, outdated Marxist doctrine to the new interpretations prophesized by people like Herbert Marcuse and Paulo Freire. Even if she didn't mean it in this way, that's what it is. So, we have that. GLB isn't trying to reform a program in schools, she tells us. She isn't trying to reform a teacher education program. She's fundamentally tackling what it means to be a teacher, what it means to teach, what it means to know and to learn. She's setting out to redefine the answers to these questions and determine what teaching looks like in her new conceptions, what student achievement looks like in her new paradigm. Quote, in this article, I attempt to build on the educational anthropological literature and suggest a new theoretical perspective to address the specific concerns of educating teachers for success with African American students. End quote. GLB argues that other researchers, all of whom are critical Marxist researchers, by the way, have found that schools that incorporate aspects of students' cultural backgrounds into their reading instruction have had more success. She's saying that she studied the literature and is going to build on it to offer a new theory of educating Black kids. She notes that, quote, teachers who used language interaction patterns that approximated the students' home cultural patterns were more successful in improving student performance, end quote. What she's setting up here is the idea that Black kids aren't successful in school because the schools were designed to uphold and reproduce the white dominant culture of the U.S. She doesn't say so explicitly in this paper, but she does in the other major work she published in the same year, towards a critical race theory of education. Her general argument about language interaction patterns is that schools are designed to reproduce the way white people talk. So talking at school to your teachers is more natural for you if you're white, but alien to you if you're Black. She's trying to say that the research she has found suggests that white kids entering school find a familiar form of talking, a familiar vocabulary, and familiar customs and norms, whereas Black kids and kids from other cultures outside of the white dominant culture don't, which alienates them and makes learning more difficult for them. Language in schools is familiar and relaxed for white kids, but it is a cultural shock to Black kids. That's what she's suggesting here. And I don't know about you, but I find this argument pretty denigrating, racist, and absurd. Her short opening argument is her literature review, the place where she's setting the stage and telling us what she's responding to. And what she's saying is that people have been studying this, and what they've discovered is that culture plays an important role in learning, an important role that isn't well understood yet and needs to be explored more and addressed. Quote, these studies, she says, have several common features. Each locates the source of student failure and subsequent achievement within the nexus of speech and language interaction patterns of the teacher and the students. Each suggests that student success, in quotes, is represented in achievement within the current social structures extant in schools. Thus, the goal of education becomes how to fit students constructed as other by virtue of their race, ethnicity, language, or social class into a hierarchical structure that is defined as meritocracy, end quote. This is a hugely clarifying passage. She's saying that people who have studied Black student failure and success have determined that whether or not Black students achieve depends on how they and their teachers communicate and interact in the classroom. It's not about whether the students are studying more or less, paying more attention or less, or whether the teacher is spending more or less time helping them. She's saying that whether or not a student succeeds is determined by how well they are adopting to the dominant culture and plugging into the current social structures of schools. So success isn't really about learning at all. It's defined in terms of student assimilation into the dominant culture. That's what she's saying. And of course she thinks this way. This is the argument that critical race theory makes in education. It's the argument that Paulo Freire made about education. It's the argument Marxists have been making about education for 60 years. She's saying students who don't talk, act, and behave white are punished by the schools and labeled as others, incapable of learning and achieving academically. She's saying schools are set up this way to reproduce our white supremacist society. That's what this passage means. There is a cultural mismatch. The culture that students bring with them doesn't match the culture of the school, a culture which represents the dominant interests of the privileged and powerful in society. And deeper than that, she's hinting here at why her program is going to be necessary. The goal shouldn't be to teach Black students, for instance, how to be white or straight or Western. If that's how you define success, then aren't successful students the ones who are the most alienated from themselves? If that's how success is defined, are the most successful the most injured, the ones who've cemented their status as other, as less than, as oppressed, by buying into the idea that they aren't good enough as they are, and they must change what it means to be them to fit into society? If all of this is true, is it the case that some students fail even though they are smart and intelligent? It's just that the benchmarks for achievement are weighted against them? Culturally relevant teaching, we'll learn, is meant to say, to hell with assimilation, into what she calls white culture. It is meant to attack what she calls white dominant culture in her other works, which boils down to the hell with American identity, individualism, and the Constitution, because those are the things the Marxists have always been after. It's meant to say there is no right way to read, write, or do math. All cultures have their own way of doing these things and being successful, and all must be celebrated and acknowledged for how they know what they know, for how they come to know the truth of their world. There isn't a right way to do anything. Who says 2 + 2 = 4? The white man? Who says indigenous knowledge isn't as good as the knowledge that put us on the moon? This is where the argument is heading. Quote, 3 of the terms employed by studies on cultural mismatch between schools and home, culturally appropriate, culturally congruent, and culturally compatible, seem to connote accommodation of student culture to mainstream culture. End quote. That is, the current research and resulting methods of using student culture in teaching are actually not really doing anything at all. They are simply teaching schools how to accommodate the cultural identity of children. They're tokenizing culture, offering Taco Tuesday as a way to feel good about how much they value everyone. Quote, only the term culturally responsive appears to refer to a more dynamic or synergistic relationship between home community culture and school culture. End quote. You can't accommodate. That doesn't change anything. In fact, that makes matters worse because you're just extending a token offering that actually reminds everyone that the culture you're accommodating isn't as good as the culture you have. We have Taco Tuesday to remind everyone that this school isn't rooted in Latin American culture. It's rooted in white, sexist, European, imperialist culture instead. Taco Tuesday doesn't change society or the structure of schools, which are assumed to be the real cause of the achievement gap. A gap that isn't actually real. And this is so important to understand. The woke, following decades of activism from people like GLB, don't care about the achievement gap. They don't care, which is why no one loses their jobs when dozens of schools in Baltimore or Chicago can't produce a single literate child. The gap only exists because we're told it exists. It only exists because the white dominant culture has created unjust benchmarks to reproduce itself. Unjust benchmarks that favor itself to the detriment of everyone else. All kids are capable of achieving because achievement looks different for all cultures. All kids would have equal outcomes if we were culturally relevant enough and could determine what those outcomes should look like for each culture. That's the slide GLB is asking us to ride. The gap only exists because an unjust dominant culture says so. That's the ride we're on. Quote, Villegas, 1988, challenged the microsocial explanations advanced by sociolinguists by suggesting that the source of cultural mismatch is located in larger social structures, and that schools as institutions serve to reproduce social inequalities. She argued that, as long as schools perform this sorting function in society, it must necessarily produce winners and losers. Therefore, culturally sensitive remedies to educational problems of oppressed minority students that ignore the political aspect of schooling are doomed to failure. End quote. So, cultural mismatch isn't just about the language and interactions students experience in the classroom. And it's not only about small group interactions and making sure all cultures are respected and accommodated in the classroom. Those are microsocial explanations. The cultural mismatch is much bigger than that. It's located in the school itself, in the history of the nation and the values that built it. It's located in politics. She's arguing that schools reproduce the society as it is, and the society as it is chooses some students to be losers by design, regardless of their merit, so what passes for meritocracy in schools is a mythology, a lie used to hide the dynamics at play. We must center politics in the classroom. That's the argument GLB is finding value in here. Radical politics that will unveil how schools pick winners and losers so those policies, practices, and procedures, the school structures, can be changed. It doesn't have to be this way. Yes, society is structuring our schools, but we can be aware of this and begin to change that dynamic and cycle in the classroom. We have agency to change the larger socio-political and cultural structures of society. We can revolutionize education. We can have our reformation, our revolution. We can't keep thinking about this problem in terms of cultural deficit or cultural disadvantage. Again, that's a mythology that hides how insidious this system is. Gloria is responding here to the people that say, yeah, this is a problem, but there's not much we can do about it outside of talking differently and doing Taco Tuesdays, because the real problem is in society itself, and that's way too big for us to change. Quote, a next step for positing effective pedagogical practices is a theoretical model that not only addresses student achievement, but also helps students to accept and affirm their cultural identity while developing critical perspectives that challenge the inequalities that schools and other institutions perpetuate. I term this pedagogy culturally relevant pedagogy. End quote. GLB is saying she's creating a new form of teaching, one that she says will address student achievement, but also help teachers and students analyze their world critically so they can challenge the status quo and change our institutions. She couldn't be any clearer. The word critically is a dead giveaway. It's a dead giveaway to what we're dealing with here. GLB is saying that what she's developing will teach kids to develop critical perspectives, meaning what she's developing will teach kids how to practice critical theory. The word critical is a code word for critical theory. If you see this word in education, just know that there is a near certainty that it means you are reading something that can only be unlocked by understanding this word. It's a key that unlocks the codex. Here, for shits and giggles, here's a quote I found while researching for the querying of the American child. Quote, I'd like to begin by considering the use of the word critical, emphasis added, to describe pedagogy, as it has essentially become one of the many code words used to make the political agenda of a course invisible, or at least less visible. This has allowed educators to access public resources in order to further the goals of social justice in education. End quote. What I'm saying here isn't controversial in the least. GLB is referencing critical theory, the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, and the critical educational theory of Paulo Freire, who Marxist educational scholar Isaac Gottesman tells us in his book, The Critical Turn in Education, was ubiquitous in education by '92, just 3 years prior to the publication of this work by GLB. Not controversial in the least. Speaking of her new theory, which isn't really new at all, it's just a regurgitation of Paulo Freire's model and method, GLB asks, quote, what constitutes student success? How can academic success and cultural success complement each other in settings where student alienation and hostility characterize the school experience? How can pedagogy promote the kind of student success that engages larger social structures and issues in a critical way? How do researchers recognize this pedagogy in action? And what are the implications for teacher preparation generated by this pedagogy? End quote. These questions do a lot of heavy foreshadowing of what's to come. What constitutes student success? What do you mean? Kids who know how to read, write, and do math. If you asked a parent, that would be their answer. Teach my kids how to be proficient in reading, writing, and math. Add in some history, but don't get weird with it. Kids who earn their way through school, that's success. and schools are characterized by alienation? That's a weird word that Marxists use a lot. I wonder why she used that word. Teachers and students should be engaging larger social structures and issues in a critical way? Uh-oh, that sounds rather activist-y. Quote, clearly, much of educational research fails to make explicit its theoretical underpinnings. However, I want to suggest that, even without explicating a theoretical framework, researchers do have explanations for why things work the way they do. These theories may be partial, poorly articulated, conflated, or even contradictory, but they exist. What is regarded as traditional educational theory, theories of reproduction, as described by Apple and Weiss, Bowles, Wheeler, critical Marxists, by the way, or neoconservative traditional theory, as described in Young, 1990, may actually be a default theory that researchers feel no need to make explicit. Thus, the theory's objectivity is unquestioned, and studies undergirded by these theories are regarded as truth or objective reality. Citing the ranking or privileging of theoretical knowledge, Code observes, and this is a quote, even when empiricist theories of knowledge prevail, knowledgeable practice constructs positions of power and privilege that are by no means as impartially ordered as strict empiricism would require. Knowledge gained from practical, untheorized, experience is commonly regarded as inferior to theoretically derived or theory-confirming knowledge, as theory is elevated above practice. End quote. GLB is saying that educators must make their theory of education explicit. Too many people, both the radicals and the conservatives, in her mind, are just assuming their theory of education is correct. It's just common sense, and no one has to question it. It runs in the background and is never confronted directly. People think it's just objective knowledge that doesn't need to be questioned. But she's arguing that this is a problem, because the theories of education are elevated above the practice of education, elevated above the experience of teaching in the classroom, elevated above what Marxists might call the concrete conditions of their learners. Now, a fundamental point GLB makes in her article is that theory and practice must be wedded together, what Marxists call praxis. And of course, because Gloria Ladson-Billings has made it very clear already in the first few pages of this paper that her theory of education is a critical theory of education. GLB is arguing that teachers must find out what theories are following them into the classroom. She's making the point that teachers must reflect critically on their beliefs and practices, wedding their theory of education with their practices of education. Their practice must inform their identified theories, and their identified theories must inform their practice. Why? Because this is a dialectical game. That's why. If we mosey on over to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, we can see that a critical theory, the thing one practices to develop critical perspectives, the thing GLB is talking about here, isn't a theory as you or I would understand it at all. It's a theory and a practice, a theory that identifies all that is wrong in the world and then demands activism to change it. Quote, critical theory aims not merely to describe social reality, but to generate insights into the forces of domination operating within society in a way that can inform practical action and stimulate change. It aims to unite theory and practice so that the theorist forms a dynamic unity with the oppressed class that is guided by an emancipatory interest, defined negatively as an interest in the abolition of social injustice, and positively as an interest in establishing reasonable conditions of life. The theory never aims simply at an increase of knowledge as such, but at emancipation from slavery. End quote. I discussed critical theory a lot in the Critical Constructivism podcast series, and I suggest you go and listen to those episodes if you'd like to learn more about it. We must know here, because GLB is telling us, that she is working from within the critical disciplines. She is working within critical theory broadly and a critical theory of education specifically. This means that she isn't concerned at all about the facts or objective reality, concerned at all about the reality of education. She is only concerned with developing something that will generate social change as prescribed by critical Marxist theories. Now, for anyone who is even remotely familiar with woke, we know that a person's positionality determines everything you need to know about them from the woke perspective, from the perspective one gains when they are brought into critical theory. You most often hear this as a black woman, as an indigenous person of color, as a fat positive trans woman, something like that. The woke think your identities, your positionality, your social, cultural, and political position determine your worldview, your Weltanschauung, as Joe Kinchlow would call it, because the woke think you are a product of structural and systemic power. You are literally a product of power. And again, go listen to the Critical Constructivism podcast series I did, if you haven't already at this point, and all of this will become fantastically clear. But I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here, so just go listen to that series if you're feeling lost. GLB is Grandma Woke, and in this paper she outlines her positionality so other people who play the critical game can better theorize how power may have determined her viewpoints. She outlines her positionality because this is all a ritual. It's a ritual all the woke academics do. If you don't do it, you're clearly not doing critical theory right, and you can't be trusted. That's how they think. GLB understands that everything under the sun must be problematized, made problematic, as they say, because that's just how Marxism works. It's the ruthless criticism of all that exists, yada, yada, yada. So, like all woke researchers, she gets in front of this problematization. Jeez, what a mouthful. Problematization, whatever. And says, quote, "This location of myself as a native can work against me. My work may be perceived as biased, or at the least skewed, because of my vested interest in the African American community. Thus, I have attempted to search for theoretical grounding that acknowledges my standpoint and simultaneously forces me to problematize it. The work of Patricia Hill Collins on Black feminist thought has been most helpful." Briefly, Collins's work is based on 4 propositions: concrete experiences as a criterion of meaning, the use of dialogue in assessing knowledge claims, the ethic of caring, and the ethic of personal accountability. Below, I briefly describe the context and methodology of my study, and then attempt to link each of these propositions to a 3-year study I conducted with successful teachers of African American students. End quote. GLB is signaling her allegiance here. Positionality statements are rituals that tell us, the reader, that everything they are about to hear is going to be woke. What's important about this section, aside from the ritual, is that GLB is saying here that her work is grounded in intersectionality. Patricia Hill Collins is a critical race theorist who, along with Kimberly Crenshaw, the fairy godmother of critical race theory, is most responsible for positionality statements in the first place. Most responsible for people listing out all of their intersecting identities every time they take a breath. This entire section is already enough to toss out the baby with the bathwater and know that culturally relevant pedagogy shouldn't be entertained by a thinking person. Okay, with the theoretical grounding and cult ritual positionality statement out of the way, GLB tells us about her study. She worked with 8 teachers, 8 teachers in a small, predominantly African-American, low-income elementary school. She had parents and school staff each identify who they thought were the best teachers at the school, and she identified the overlap and included those teachers in her study. She interviewed the teachers and then spent 2 years observing, recording, and interviewing them. And as I stated at the beginning, GLB is trying to set up culturally relevant teaching as the only way we can elevate the achievement of Black children. Quote, "My own interest in these issues of teaching excellence for African American students came as a result of my desire to challenge deficit paradigms that prevailed in the literature on African American learners. Partly as a result of my own experiences as a learner, a teacher, and a parent, I was convinced that, Despite the literature, there were teachers who were capable of excellent teaching for African American students. Thus, my work required a paradigmatic shift toward looking in the classrooms of excellent teachers through the reality of those teachers. In this next section, I discuss how my understanding of my own theoretical grounding connected with this study." End quote. She's framing this as, "Some people say we just can't expect black children to achieve, but these teachers prove we can." This framing is sickening. Did you catch that? There were teachers who were capable of excellent teaching for African American students. What is she suggesting here? She's suggesting black kids are very different from other children and need to be taught in certain ways if they can ever be expected to achieve. And of course, she suggests this because she is woke and thinks that schools are sites that reproduce a white supremacist society. Sites that purposely ignore and invalidate the lived experiences and concrete conditions of black children because society doesn't accept those experiences as valid forms of being in the world. The whole point of schools, in the woke view, as it relates to race, is to beat out everything that white society doesn't like. Other ways of knowing, other ways of being, as the woke so often say. The goal of schools is to reproduce whiteness in this view. And in layman's street terms, the goal of schools is to make all kids white. If kids don't want to be or act white, the schools fail them. That's the messaging hidden in this passage, a messaging which is much less hidden in other works, like "But That's Just Good Teaching," a paper we could explore in the future. After telling us about her studies methodology, GLB circles back to the points she highlighted earlier about the importance of Patricia Hill Collins' influence on her work. She again cites Collins, saying that, quote, "Individuals who have lived through the experiences about which they claim to be experts are more believable and credible than those who have merely read about or thought about such experience." End quote. This is the lived experience argument. I've lived it. I've experienced it. Therefore, I'm the expert and cannot be questioned. My perception is reality. And again, I refer you to the critical constructivism series I did if you really want to deep dive into this insane point, because the woke quite literally believe perception is reality. They believe we construct the world in our heads, the only world that matters. There is no such thing as objectivity, no such thing as a real world that exists outside of our collective consciousness for these people. It's absolute insanity. This argument, "My lived experience grants me greater insight into the truth of the world, therefore give me all of the power and money," has steamrolled unsuspecting people for a long time. And GLB is saying that her theory of culturally relevant teaching is rooted in it. We could spend a lot of time dunking on this ridiculous point, but let me flesh out a couple of examples to help you understand how ludicrous this is. The first obvious example is eyewitnesses. We all know they suck. Eyewitness testimony sucks because, as it turns out, eyewitnesses and their lived experiences get things wrong all of the time. There's a reason why eyewitness testimony is not as strong as physical evidence or hard proof in the court of law. People are easily fooled. People forget. Our memories aren't very good, and we have a fairly large problem of creating false memories, etc., etc., etc. You can find 1,000 videos on YouTube explaining all of this. The second is an example is more pointed and demonstrates how easily it can be to hijack lived experience, especially when that personal experience has been primed. Now, I first heard about this experiment, this example I'm going to cover, from Konstantin Krysin of trigonometry fame. The experiment, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1980, is titled "Perceptions of the Impact of Negatively Valued Physical Characteristics on Social Interaction." And it was clever and revealed just how much our lived experience can be hijacked if someone else is telling us which lens we must view certain social interactions through. For the experiment, the researchers told women that they were going to place fake scars on their faces and then send them into an interview with another subject. They told the women to pay attention to eye contact, degree of tenseness, amount of talking, degree of perceived patronization, and amount of liking for the subject as a person. Also, the women were asked to estimate how attractive the interviewer found them and whether the interviewer would have been more comfortable with a closer or more distant seating arrangement. When the women returned from the experiment, they reported all sorts of gazing, uneasiness, lots of patronization, and a general sense that they were being discriminated against because of their scar. But there was a catch. Quote, subjects in the facial scar condition were asked if a cosmetic preparation used to simulate facial disfigurement in dramatic productions could be applied to their face. As the material dries, it gives the appearance of a healed scar, the size and extent of which can be controlled by the application procedures. The scar was placed on the subject's right cheek between the ear and the corner of the mouth and was of a size to be clearly noticeable in face-to-face interaction. The experimenter gave the subject a small hand mirror to confirm that an authentic-looking scar had been placed on her face. As she put the mirror down, he informed her that he would have to put a moisturizer over the scar to keep it from cracking and peeling off. In the process of moisturizing the scar, the experimenter removed it without the subject's knowledge. End quote. The women found the discrimination they were primed to find. They had no scar on their face during the interviews. The scar didn't exist. The moisturizer was fake. The person was just removing the scar without telling them. Yet their lived experience told them that they did experience discrimination. For them, the scar was more real than the reality of the situation, which is that the scar was removed and a non-existent scar couldn't possibly be the cause of discrimination they uncovered in their interactions. Quote, individuals who have lived through the experiences about which they claim to be experts are more believable and credible than those who have merely read and thought about such experience. End quote. Who would be closer to the truth in the experiment we just described? The person reading about the experiment, you or I, who knows about the deception, or the subject of the experiment, who would bet the house on the fact that they were victims of discrimination? GLB is telling us that lived experience is a central component of culturally relevant pedagogy. The lived experience of the teacher and of the student will be more important than facts or objective reality. Because for the woke, perception is all that matters. So perception is all that we must care about when evaluating truth claims. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, jeez. Next, Gloria Ladson-Billings addresses another of Patricia Hill Collins's points, the use of dialogue when assessing knowledge claims. Quote, the second criterion suggests that knowledge emerges in dialectical relationships. Rather than the voice of one authority, meaning is made as a product of dialogue between and among individuals. In the case of my study, dialogue was critical in assessing knowledge claims. Early in the study, each teacher participated in an ethnographic interview. Although I had specific areas I wanted to broach with each teacher, the teacher's own life histories and interests determined how much time was spent on the various areas. In some cases, the interviews reflected teachers' belief in the salience of his or her family background and education. In other instances, teachers talked more about their pedagogical, philosophical, and political perspectives. Even after I began collecting data via classroom observations, it was the teachers' explanations and clarifications that helped to construct the meaning of what transpired in the classrooms. Additionally, after I collected data from the classroom observations and classroom videotaping, the teachers convened as a research collaborative to examine both their own and one another's pedagogy. In these meetings, meaning was constructed through reciprocal dialogue. Instead of merely accepting Berliner's notion that experts operate on a level of automaticity and intuition that does not allow for accurate individual critique and interpretation, that is, they cannot explain how they do what they do, together, the teachers were able to make sense of their own and their colleagues' practices. The ongoing dialogue allowed them the opportunity to re-examine and rethink their practices. End quote. Knowledge emerges in dialectical relationships? What does that mean? It means GLB is telling us what Paulo Freire told us, which is that knowledge, truth, isn't something that any of us have. It's not something we can access out in the real world. It's something we create. We create truth based on our perceptions, and we create new truth, thicker truth, but not true truth, as you or I would understand it, thicker truth, as the critical constructivists call it. We create it together when we talk. You tell me your truth, and I tell you my truth, and we create a new, thicker relational truth by understanding each other's truths. All of this is to say, the point she's trying to make by drawing on Collins is that a teacher can't just tell students what's true. The teacher must engage in dialogue with students to learn about their concrete conditions, to learn about their truths so they can update her theory of teaching to accommodate the knowledge her students are telling her about. The passage I quoted is a modeling of this process. GLB is updating her theory, and the teachers she's observing are updating their theories based on the relational truths they are building together. They aren't trying to get down to the truth of what students are learning, the truth of helping children become academically successful. That's the key takeaway here. The truth doesn't matter. If someone were to come in and say, this is what the experts say, and it's the best way to help children succeed, GLB would say things like, who certified that knowledge? Who decided that was the best way to teach? How did power manifest in those decisions? What was the positionality of the researcher? In other words, again, the truth of the matter doesn't matter. Only dialectical relationships matter. Only subjective and relational truths matter. This point is probably the most confusing and hardest to understand for the average person because it's simply too insane to be believed. It's too insane to believe that people responsible for the educational practices in schools today literally don't think the truth exists. Literally think that all truth is made up in relationships between people and mediated by systemic and structural power. It's just too insane to be believed. But I didn't write this paper, they did. Everything, as I say, changes once you realize you're dealing with a communist. Now GLB discusses what it means to care for kids within the theoretical model she's developing. She says she's following Patricia Hill Collins' work on the ethic of caring, as we noted earlier. Quote, much has been discussed in feminist literature about women and caring. Other feminists have been critical of any essentialized notion of women and suggest that no empirical evidence exists to support the notion that women care in ways different from men or that any such caring informs their scholarship and work. I argue that Collins's use of caring refers not merely to effective connections between and among people, but to the articulation of a greater sense of commitment to what scholarship and/or pedagogy can mean in the lives of people. For example, in this study, the teachers were not all demonstrative and affectionate towards the students. Instead, their common thread of caring was their concern for the implications their work had on their students' lives, the welfare of the community, and unjust social arrangements. Thus, rather than the idiosyncratic caring for individual students, the teachers spoke of the importance of their work for preparing the students for confronting inequitable and undemocratic social structures. End quote. Well, this is fun. She starts this passage by nodding to queer theory, saying that some people, the queer theorists, say that women don't exist. Way too deep of a rabbit hole to go down now. Go read The Queering of the American Child. She says caring isn't just about nurturing, supporting, and developing an emotional bond. She says caring is about a commitment to the future, a commitment to social change and social justice, preparing students to go out and change unjust social arrangements. That's caring. Caring means doing whatever you can to teach kids to be activists, not the silly, idiosyncratic caring of individual kids in your care. No, not that. The point is to prepare kids to confront inequitable and undemocratic social structures. So, the point is to teach kids how to do critical theories. It's that simple. That's what she's saying here. If you care for your kids, you teach them to do critical theory. That's it. Now that we know what GLB thinks about the truth and what it means to care, she turns to accountability. Because if you know anything about these people, their woke faith always holds them accountable. The work is never done, they say. Quote, in this final dimension, Collins addresses the notion that who makes knowledge claims is as important as what those knowledge claims are. Thus, the idea that individuals can objectively argue a position, whether they themselves agree with the position, as in public debating, is foreign. Individuals' commitments to ideological and/or value positions are important in understanding knowledge claims. In this study, the teachers demonstrated this ethic of personal accountability in the kind of pedagogical stands they took. Several of the teachers spoke of defying administrative mandates in order to do what they believed was right for students. Others gave examples of proactive actions they took to engage in pedagogical practices more consistent with their beliefs and values. For example, one teacher was convinced that the school district's mandated reading program was inconsistent with what she was learning about literacy teaching and learning from a critical perspective. She decided to write a proposal to the school board asking for experimental status for a literacy approach she wanted to use in her classroom. Her proposal was buttressed by current research in literacy and would not cost the district any more than the proposed program. Ultimately, she was granted permission to conduct her experiment, and its success allowed other teachers to attempt it in subsequent years. Although Collins's work provided me with a way to think about my work as a researcher, it did not provide me with a way to theorize about the teacher's practices. Ultimately, it was my responsibility to generate theory as I practiced theory. As previously mentioned, this work builds on earlier anthropological and sociolinguistic attempts at a cultural fit between students' home culture and school culture. However, by situating it in a more critical paradigm, a theory of culturally relevant pedagogy would necessarily propose to do three things: produce students who can achieve academically, produce students who demonstrate cultural competence, and develop students who can both understand and critique the existing social order. The next section discusses each of these elements of culturally relevant pedagogy. End quote. Again, if it wasn't clear, it is now. Objectivity is a foreign concept. Okay. And if it wasn't clear before, it is now. The woke are only accountable to their faith and doctrine, which is why teachers are so fond of defying administrative mandates. For example, one teacher was convinced that the school district's mandated reading program was inconsistent with what she was learning about literacy teaching, learning from a critical perspective. So, one teacher wanted to throw away phonics and effective reading instruction because that teacher had learned about Paulo Freire's methods. Got it. For that teacher, learning to read wasn't the objective. Learning to read the world critically was. Learning to become an activist was the new objective. So the hell with the administration, I guess. GLB tells us that all of this theory she's been talking about is great. All of the Marxist theorizing is awesome. But how do we practice it? How do we take our theory into the classroom and practice it on kids? We develop a pedagogy. We develop teaching practices to enact our theory and bring it to life. She tells us that she has done this, and she calls it culturally relevant pedagogy, which seeks to do three things. Number one, produce students who can achieve academically. But not academically as in learning to read, write, and do math. That would only stabilize an unjust social order. She means achieve academically in terms of developing a critical consciousness. Academic achievement is measured by how well the child takes to the brainwashing. Number two, produce students who can demonstrate cultural competence, meaning Produce students who can analyze their identity through a woke lens. Students who can become competent in analyzing their culture, its history, its production, the socialization processes into it, as a Marxist would understand it. That's precisely what this means. GLB also asks that students become competent in at least one other culture. And of course, crisis and conflict is the engine of Marxism. So students need to go explore and find crisis in the intersection between their culture and another one. And number 3, the biggie, the dead giveaway. Produce students who can develop critical consciousness. Develop the ability to critique and change the existing social order. Can she be any clearer? This isn't about teaching kids to grow up, fit in, and succeed in society. It's about teaching them to tear away at society relentlessly until the pillars topple and the roof comes down on all of our heads. The utopia is under the rubble somewhere. Go and find it, kiddos. Quote, not only must teachers encourage academic success and cultural competence, they must help students to recognize, understand, and critique current social inequities. This notion presumes that teachers themselves recognize social inequities and their causes. However, teacher educators have demonstrated that many prospective teachers not only lack these understandings, but reject information regarding social inequity. This suggests that more work on recruiting particular kinds of students into teaching must be done. Also, we are fortunate to have models of this kind of cultural critique emanating from the work of civil rights workers here in the U.S. that has been incorporated into the critical and feminist work currently being done by numerous scholars. And here she cites Ellsworth, Giroux, McLaren, of course. Teachers who meet the cultural critique criteria must be engaged in a critical pedagogy, which is a deliberate attempt to influence how and what knowledge and identities are produced within and among particular sets of social relations. It can be understood as a practice through which people are incited to acquire a particular moral character. As both a political and practical activity, it attempts to influence the occurrences and qualities of experiences. End quote. Again, this was written in 95. And GLB wasn't the first to say it, but her work makes it clear. The woke target particular kinds of students into teaching who will be more susceptible to the brainwashing, more susceptible to falling into the new religious faith, the prophetic vision of social justice, as Giroux, who GLB quotes here, says. She quotes a ton of Marxists here, and all of them work within this critical tradition. This tradition of applying critical theory to education, chief among them being Paulo Freire, of course, who she cites as well. The point again is to incite people to acquire a particular moral character. It's to incite people to join the new faith. If you're going to brainwash kids, you must first capture the teachers. And again, as Gottesman says in his book, which is impossible to overquote, these critical Marxists had captured the ed schools completely by 92, which is why we see a massive boom in critical theories being applied to education. Critical theory, critical pedagogy, culturally relevant teaching, critical race theory, queer theory, post-colonial theory, etc., 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 after this date. Teachers must know how to see the world as GLB sees it, see it through the woke lens. And once they can do that, they must make what they see explicit, because that's how woke works. You create the world. You manifest it in your mind. Your perception is reality. So if you speak it into the world, it becomes true. That's why they must make their faith explicit, because then, in their minds, it's true, and everyone must acknowledge it. Quote, thus, the teachers in this study were not reluctant to identify political underpinnings of the students' community and social world. One teacher worked with her students to identify poorly utilized space in the community, examine heretofore inaccessible archival records about the early history of the community, plan alternative uses for vacant shopping malls, and write urban plans which they presented before the city council. In a description of similar political activity, a class of African American middle school students in Dallas identified the problem of their schools being surrounded by liquor stores. Zoning regulations in the city made some areas dry, while the students' school was in a wet area. The students identified the fact that schools serving white, upper-middle-class students were located in dry areas, while schools in poor communities were in wet areas. The students, assisted by their teacher, planned a strategy for exposing this inequity. By using mathematics, literacy, social, and political skills, the students were able to prove their points with reports, editorials, charts, maps, and graphs. In both of these examples, teachers allowed students to use their community circumstances as official knowledge. Their pedagogy and the students' learning became a form of cultural critique. End quote. Teaching children to read their world politically and inspiring them to go out and be activists to change it. This is the learning objective of the pedagogy GLB is designing. She's telling us these teachers were able to help Black children succeed because they were able to teach those Black students to read their world politically, to read their world critically, to use math for political purposes, to organize and act to change the world. And none of this new pedagogy is possible unless the teachers and students understand that they are no longer individuals. They must become collectivists, because culturally relevant teaching is a collectivist sport. It's a collectivist sport because the game is Marxism, but played in a cultural domain primarily, rather than a straightforward economic one. Quote, much has been written about classroom social interactions. Perhaps the strength of some of the research in this area is evidenced by its impact on classroom practices. For example, teachers throughout the nation have either heard of or implemented various forms of cooperative learning, cross-aged, multi-aged, and heterogeneous ability groupings. While these classroom arrangements may be designed to improve student achievement, culturally relevant teachers consciously create social interactions to help them meet the three previously mentioned criteria of academic success, cultural competence, and critical consciousness. Briefly, the teachers maintain fluid student-teacher relationships, demonstrate a connectedness with all of the students, develop a community of learners, and encourage students to learn collaboratively and be responsible for one another. End quote. Again, we see this Freirean engine here. Knowledge must be co-created with students in relationship. This is a super important point. Teacher and student relationships must be fluid because the teacher must learn the truth her students are telling her about, must learn the concrete conditions of their lived experiences so she can better plan how to radicalize them, better plan how to teach them to change the socio-political order. The whole class must melt into a collectivist mass that can co-create the new world by learning together about all of the things they want to destroy in the current one. The teacher must fish for issues. She has to look for issues to set the hook into so she can begin to teach kids how to be activists. She can't just show up to class and teach them something. She has to learn from them about their concrete conditions if she's going to complete the learning objective, which isn't to learn anything other than becoming a radical activist. Are they poor? Okay, that's an issue we can set the hook in. Now we can read the world of poverty. Why are some people poor and others aren't? Why is this neighborhood better than the next? Why are some fathers in prison and others aren't? Why do some mothers have degrees and some don't? We're off to the races. Now we can use a reading lesson as a mediator for a political literacy lesson, as a mediator for brainwashing. That's how all of this works. And it works this way because Gloria Ladson-Billings is just regurgitating Paulo Freire's methods. And all of this must be done collaboratively because the woke want to kill the individual. Individuals must become avatars of variously positioned groups. Everything is collectivist because the kids must learn to see themselves as collectivists. I'm not Kim, I'm a black girl. I'm not John, I'm a white boy. If the kids aren't identifying as avatars for larger groups, then they can't be radicalized into taking up causes that aren't theirs to take up. Can't be radicalized into seeing themselves as directly affected by systemic and structural problems that supposedly affect the group. You're black, Kim, so that means certain things for you. You're white, John, so that means certain things for you. It's hard to set the hook if these kids don't see themselves as avatars for some group that you're telling them is oppressed. It's hard to set the hook if you can't get them to step onto the stage and identify as victims. Identify as the group you're discussing. Quote, to solidify the social relationships in their classes, the teachers encouraged the students to learn collaboratively, teach each other, and be responsible for the academic success of others. These collaborative arrangements were not necessarily structured like those of cooperative learning. Instead, the teachers used a combination of formal and informal peer collaborations. One teacher used a buddy system, where each student was paired with another. The buddies checked each other's homework and class assignments. Buddies quizzed each other for tests, and if one buddy was absent, it was the responsibility of the other to call to see how they could help with make-up work. The teachers used this ethos of reciprocity and mutuality to insist that one person's success was the success of all, and one person's failure was the failure of all. These feelings were exemplified by the teacher who insisted, "We're a family. We have to care for one another as if our very survival depends on it. Actually, it does." End quote. This is so wicked. It's so wicked because an unsuspecting person might hear something like this and think, wow, that's a great idea. Kids collaborating? They'll have to do plenty of that in the workplace. It's great they're learning to get along. When in reality, this is nothing more than a collectivization process. We're a family, they say. Yeah, the new family your child is adopted into without your knowledge. Given the context of the rest of this paper, this passage is absolutely wicked. It demonstrates that all of this is designed to get your child to stop seeing themselves as an individual and start seeing themselves as a collectivist. Stop seeing their family as family and adopt a new family that is in a life and death struggle for freedom. We have to care for one another as if our very survival depended on it. Actually, it does. In The Queering of the American Child, James Lindsay and I discussed trauma bonding and the cult initiation process. What we're reading in GLB here is the pedagogy that queer theory adopts to push kids into the queer cult. This passage might sound innocent, but it's anything but that. There are reasons why everything in culturally relevant pedagogy is designed to be collaborative, why everything is designed for group work. It levels the individual so they can be reborn into the collective. Quote, the third proposition that emerged from this study was one that indicated how the teachers thought about knowledge, the curriculum or content they taught, and the assessment of that knowledge. Once again, I will summarize their conceptions and beliefs about knowledge. Knowledge is not static. It is shared, recycled, and constructed. Knowledge must be viewed critically. Teachers must be passionate about knowledge and learning. Teachers must scaffold or build bridges to facilitate learning. Assessment must be multifaceted, incorporating multiple forms of excellence. End quote. As we discussed earlier, GLB is a critical constructivist, and this means that her theory and pedagogy don't acknowledge objective truth, don't acknowledge anything you would consider to be true and objective about the world. Nothing. The critical constructivists think that absolutely everything is a product of our collective minds, a product created in relation with one another. Knowledge is constructed, as she says. She doesn't mean we learn things and build upon our mental models as we learn. She means that the world is literally built in our heads. That's the constructivist position, which she marries with critical theory, because she is a critical constructivist. That's why knowledge must be viewed critically. And the teachers helping their children to become world builders who have awakened to the prophetic vision of social justice, as Giroux would say, must be passionate about this because it's a damn cult. They have no other choice. They must do the work. And part of that work is making sure they aren't teaching to an objective test, aren't teaching to a learning objective that every child must reach for. They must incorporate multiple forms of excellence because all children have their own truth and knowledge they are exploring in the classroom. So there are no right answers. There are no objective criteria. The critical constructivist doesn't care. The only learning objective is falling deeper into critical consciousness, deeper into the Marxist faith. Quote, another example of the teacher's conceptions of knowledge was demonstrated in the critical stance the teacher took toward the school curriculum. Although cognizant of the need to teach certain things because of a district-wide testing policy, the teacher helped their students engage in a variety of forms of critical analyses. For one teacher, this meant critique of the social studies textbooks that were under consideration by a state evaluation panel. For two of the others, critique came in the form of resistance to district-approved reading materials. Both of these teachers showed the students that it was they who were supposed to be using Both of these teachers showed the students what it was they were supposed to be using, along with what they were going to use and why. They both trusted the students with this information and enlisted them as allies against the school district's policies. End quote. So, the students aren't expected to meet rigorous learning objectives. They're expected to learn how to practice their critical analysis and become more and more woke. Does your average person realize that culturally relevant pedagogy enlists students as allies against the school district's policies? I bet not. Do they know it enlists students as allies of the revolution? I bet not. Oh, yikes. Quote, I began this article arguing for a theory of culturally relevant pedagogy. I also suggested that the tensions that surround my position as a native in the research field force me to face the theoretical and philosophical biases I bring to my work in overt and explicit ways. Thus, I situated my work in the context of Black feminist thought. I suggested that culturally relevant teaching must meet three criteria: an ability to develop students academically, a willingness to nurture and support cultural competence, and the development of a socio-political or critical consciousness. End quote. We're in the final stretch. She's told us that she has created a teaching method that turns kids into radical activists. She says she's situated. Wow. She says she's situated, that is difficult to say, her work in the context of Black feminist thought, which you should know doesn't necessarily mean a Black woman who is a feminist. GLB is using Black feminist the same way that Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author of the 1619 Project, uses it, as in politically Black. GLB is telling us she developed culturally relevant pedagogy within the context of critical race theory, which no one is surprised by because she published towards a critical race theory of education the same year she published this paper. Actually, they were both published in the fall, at the same time, essentially. I might need to cover that paper in a future podcast. I don't know. We'll see how people react to this one. GLB mentions critical consciousness by name, a concept taken directly from Paulo Freire, whose program she has used as the engine of her new development. Culturally relevant teaching is Paulo Freire's method repackaged to work in the West. That's it. It's a new variant of the same disease, one with more receptor sites so things like critical race theory and queer theory can plug into it more easily. Quote, a culturally relevant pedagogy is designed to problematize teaching and encourage teachers to ask about the nature of the student-teacher relationship, the curriculum, schooling, and society. End quote. That's not the sales pitch you heard from your school district when they decided to dive headfirst into this hell, is it? I think not. Here's GLB's conclusion and a summary of what we've discussed today with this paper. Quote, This study represents a beginning look at the ways that teachers might systematically include student culture in the classroom as authorized or official knowledge. It also is a way to encourage praxis as an important aspect of research. This kind of research needs to continue in order to support new conceptions of collaboration between teachers and researchers. We need research that proposes alternate models of pedagogy, coupled with exemplars of successful pedagogies. More importantly, we need to be willing to look for exemplary practice in those classrooms and communities that too many of us already dismiss as incapable of producing excellence. The implication of continuing this kind of work means that research grounded in practice of exemplary teachers will form a significant part of the knowledge base on which we build teacher preparation. It means that the research community will have to be willing to listen to and heed the wisdom and practice of these excellent practitioners. Additionally, we need to consider methodologies that present more robust portraits of teaching. Meaningful combinations of quantitative and qualitative inquiries must be employed to help us understand the deeply textured, multi-layered enterprise of teaching. I presume that the work I have been doing raises more questions than it answers. A common question asked by practitioners is, "Isn't what you described just good teaching?" And while I do not deny that it is good teaching, I pose a counter question. Why does so little of it seem to occur in the classrooms populated by African American students? Another question that arises is whether or not this pedagogy is so idiosyncratic that only certain teachers can engage in it. I would argue that the diversity of these teachers and the variety of their teaching strategies they employed challenge that notion. The common feature they shared was a classroom practice grounded in what they believed about the educability of the students. Unfortunately, this raises troubling thoughts about those teachers who are not successful, but we cannot assume that they do not believe that some students are incapable or unworthy of being educated. The reason for their lack of success are far too complex for this discussion. Ultimately, my responsibility as a teacher-educator who works primarily with young, middle-class, white women is to provide them with the examples of culturally relevant teaching in both theory and practice. My responsibility as a researcher is to continue to inquire in order to move toward a theory of culturally relevant pedagogy. End quote. What have we learned today? We've learned that a scholar who was educated during the critical turn in education decided to fashion a new form of pedagogy, a new way of conceptualizing teaching and learning, a new way of thinking about what teaching and learning must look like to successfully educate children. This scholar took Paulo Freire's critical theory of education and adapted it for the U.S. context. Freire considered class and colonial occupation as the primary axis of oppression. He developed a Marxist theory of knowledge, teaching, and learning that is designed to develop a critical consciousness in learners. That is, Freire's theory is designed to wake up, to make woke the learners he's responsible for. Critical consciousness, as Freire himself defines it, is the ability to analyze the world critically and take action to change it. It's teaching learners how to ruthlessly criticize all in existence and transform their world critically, as in, transform their world in accordance with postmodern neo-Marxist critical theory. Critical consciousness, as we define it in The Queering of the American Child, is the Marxist belief that everything in society is designed to oppress you, and the only way to see the truth about the world is to become a Marxist who practices critical theories to denounce the sources of oppression in the world. Or, said more simply, critical consciousness is the belief that one must read socio-political conditions critically and take action. Or, in simplest terms, having critical consciousness makes you woke. Woke equals critical consciousness. Gloria Ladson-Billings took this same program, the exact same learning objective, achieving critical consciousness, and adapted it to work in the U.S. context. Instead of colonial occupation and economic class as the central axis of oppression, she made student culture central to her program, specifically culture related to racial culture or ethnic culture. Under the guise of fixing the achievement gap, she commercialized Paulo Freire's program in the U.S., arguing that the reason some students don't achieve in schools is because schools weren't designed for them. She argued that teachers in schools only know how to educate white kids for white culture, because those teachers have been socialized, a big Marxist buzzword, into a white supremacist society. That is to say, the teachers have been brainwashed into thinking that white European culture is the standard, the norm, the unquestioned and unassailable, prototypical, and best. Her arguments rest on the idea that we are all blind to the fact that the culture we have in the U.S., the culture our schools reproduce by brainwashing kids into it, is a white and European one, a culture that is no better than any other culture we could otherwise educate children into. In fact, it's one of the worst. The reason some kids fail in schools is not because those children aren't up to par. It's because their teachers in schools are punishing them for not adopting and adapting to the dominant culture. They're punishing them for not assimilating. That's the argument. Therefore, we must become aware of this whole woke worldview and reshape teacher education in schools. All kids don't have an equal shot at the same outcome until we transform what it means to know, what it means to learn, and what it means to educate children. We must center, another big Marxist buzzword, we must center the marginalized knowledges and cultural practices of our oppressed learners. We must adapt all teaching and learning to make it culturally relevant for each learner. We must begin to accept other ways of knowing that other cultures bring to the table. We must begin to accept other ways of excellence that other cultures bring to the table. We need to ditch all of the benchmarks we've always relied on and begin to accept new benchmarks of success. Reading, writing, doing math, and behaving look different for all cultures, so we need to develop teaching practices that accept and highlight the differences in the classroom. What this boils down to is the idea that teachers must be taught that there is no correct way to read, write, or do math. Remember, objectivity is a foreign concept, GLB says. All learners bring their lived experience and personal and relational truths into the classroom, truths that must be accepted as valid forms of knowledge that can be registered and used to lead students into critical consciousness. The point of this paper, toward a theory of culturally relevant pedagogy, is to argue that we must transform schools broadly, but teacher education specifically. Teachers must be educated and re-educated to think that culturally relevant pedagogy is the only way to educate children. They must be educated to believe that you're a racist and a bigot if you think that all students can be held to the same standards. The point of this paper is to make Paulo Freire's model and methods palatable for a Western audience, to extort well-meaning people and convince them that the only way to close the achievement gap is to adopt this Marxist program. Gloria covered an example of what good teaching looks like earlier. She said that it looks like children analyzing their culture and community through a political lens. It looks like the middle school students in Dallas identifying the problem of their school being surrounded by liquor stores. It looks like students, quote, using mathematics, literacy, social, and political skills, end quote, to do activism in their community. Make no mistake, this is Paulo Freire's program. Freire said that we must generate themes in the classroom that can pique student interest and make the lesson more engaging. A great summary of what a generative theme is comes to us via the critical constructivist Joe Kinchelow speaking on Freire's method. He says a generative theme is, quote, a topic taken from students' knowledge of their own lived experiences that is compelling and controversial enough to elicit their excitement and commitment. Such themes are saturated with affect, emotion, and meaning because they engage the fears, anxieties, hopes, and dreams of both students and their teachers. Generative themes rise at the point where the personal lives of students intersect with the larger society in the globalized world. End quote. Once students are engaged and hooked on a political, emotional theme, For every sought to launch into a political lesson that analyzed that theme through the lens of critical theory, through a Marxist lens. The point is to get students to identify a victim in the theme, to identify a group that is oppressed. It is, after all, a pedagogy of the oppressed. Marxism is a conflict theory, and conflict is needed for the project to work. Conflict is needed for the radicalization to work. After victims are identified, the goal is to convince learners to step onto the stage of history and identify with the victims, to recognize that they are victims in the political theme they've been discussing. The goal is to get them emotional, convince them that they are victims, and then offer them a vision of activism that can relieve their emotional discomfort in psychological trauma. And this is precisely what we see in Gloria's program. The goal is to generate a theme. Talk to students about politics in their community. Why is it that there are so many liquor stores in this area and not that one? Then the goal is to generate and reveal conflict. Oops, looks like there aren't many liquor stores in the white upper middle class schools. Those are dry areas. There must be only one explanation. Aren't you all upset about all of these liquor stores? They're only here because you're black. That's unfair. That's inequitable. Something must be done because you are victims of this situation. So, let's hijack this math lesson we're supposed to be doing and use it as a mediator to develop your political literacy. Under the guise of doing math, let's spend all of our time discussing liquor stores and zoning laws so we can march the class over to City Hall and do activism. That's how we're going to use, quote, community circumstances as official knowledge. This pedagogy and the students' learning become a form of cultural critique, end quote. Now don't get me wrong. I wish there were less liquor stores. I wish there were less alcoholics. I wish children didn't live in neighborhoods riddled with criminals, deviants, and degenerates. But this is precisely the sentiment this brainwashing program latches onto. The liquor store is a generative theme. It generates emotion. How can you be against trying to better the neighborhoods of black children? That's the sentiment being weaponized here to convince schools, parents, and teachers that children shouldn't be learning math. They should be learning math for social justice. They shouldn't be learning math for math's sake. They should be learning the math of social activism. They should be steeped in a lesson designed to radicalize them, a radicalization lesson disguising itself as a mathematical one. Do you see how wicked this is? Now imagine a child spends all year in lessons like this. Lessons that convince them that they are an avatar for a group, one that is oppressed beyond measure. What does that do to the psychology of a child? Kevin Kumashiro, the queer activist and educator we cover in The Queering of the American Child, says the point of this method is to draw students into psychological crisis so they can be redirected into a radical ideology that helps them get through the crisis productively. He says educators have a responsibility to do this. And of course he does. That's how brainwashing and thought reform work. They don't work by telling kids that X is the way the world works, or Y is how you must think about this or that. They work by socially and emotionally priming an individual to be more receptive to the ideology you want them to adopt. It all works by psychologically conditioning and traumatizing kids and then offering a pressure release valve in an all-encompassing cult worldview that promises to resolve the trauma productively. Kids only feel safe when they're in the comfort of the cult. They've been brainwashed into thinking everything else is the cause of their pain, loneliness, anger, and shame. Gloria's program is designed to generate cultural themes, convince students that they are avatars for collective groups, and then use their destabilized emotional states to hook them on Marxism. That's the goal. Culturally relevant teaching must, she says, lead to the development of a socio-political or critical consciousness. That's the benchmark of academic success in this program. Is the student more critically conscious? If yes, it's working. They're successful. If not, more brainwashing. This paper has been cited over 13,000 times. Gloria set out to popularize culturally relevant pedagogy and get it into teacher education programs as the hallmark of being certified as a good teacher. Culturally relevant teaching was essentially unheard of in the early 90s. Today, it's our school's most prized educational concept. It's a pillar of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive school. The NEA pushes this. The ed schools all push this. The U.S. Department of Education pushes this. Does your child's teacher? It may be time to ask.